February 1965, Audubon Ballroom, Harlem. 2:47 p.m. Malcolm X sits at a corner table, eating alone, when a young black waitress approaches a white customer in an expensive suit. The man looks up, disgusted. "I don't take food from your kind," he says, loud enough for 40 people to hear. He throws the menu at her feet. The entire room freezes. Security moves toward the confrontation. Malcolm raises a single finger without looking up. Everyone stops. He stands, walks to the table carrying a white linen napkin. What he said next was recorded by 3 different people, remembered differently by all of them, and captured in a single blurred photograph that changed how America saw him. This happened 48 hours before his assassination. Napkin? It vanished that night, then reappeared 30 years later with the waitress's granddaughter, carrying a message no one expected. This story went viral decades before viral existed. February 1965. Malcolm X stood at the peak of American notoriety and at the edge of his own death, though only he seemed to sense it. He'd recently broken from the Nation of Islam after 12 years as their most visible spokesman. The split was vicious, public, and dangerous. Death threats arrived daily. FBI agents followed him openly, not even pretending to hide. His phone was tapped. His hotel rooms were bugged. Newspapers called him the most dangerous man in America, more threatening than any foreign enemy, more radical than any homegrown revolutionary. White America feared him. Black America was divided. Some saw a prophet. Others saw a provocateur who'd gone too far. Television interviews from that month show a man coiled tight, speaking in controlled bursts about separation, about justice, about the cost of dignity. He looked exhausted. He looked ready, but the Malcolm X that America saw on those grainy TV screens, the one who pointed fingers and demanded revolution, that wasn't the whole story. The private Malcolm, the one who read philosophy and wrote letters and reconsidered positions, was less known. He was evolving, questioning, softening in ways the public wouldn't see until decades later, when historians sifted through his final writings. 2 weeks before someone killed him, he was becoming someone new. The Audubon Ballroom in Harlem was more than a speaking venue. It was a community space, a cultural landmark, a place where Malcolm felt, if not safe, then at least seen. The building contained a large hall where he delivered speeches to packed crowds, but it also housed a small restaurant on the ground floor. The restaurant served simple food, chicken, greens, cornbread, coffee, and catered to neighborhood people, activists, artists, and the occasional curious outsider. Clara Washington was 19 years old that February, a single mother taking night classes in culinary school while working lunch shifts 5 days a week. She recognized Malcolm the first time he walked in. Everyone did. But he preferred a corner booth, always ate alone, always ordered the same meal, chicken, no sides, black coffee. He tipped exactly 20%, spoke politely, and never lingered. Clara kept her distance. She served him the way she served everyone, efficiently, respectfully, without fuss. He seemed to appreciate that. He never asked her name. She never offered it. It was a professional arrangement in a world that didn't often allow black women much professional dignity. February 19th, 1965, started as an ordinary Friday. Clara clocked in at noon, tied her apron, checked her station. She had no idea she was about to be part of something that would outlive them both. At 2:35 p.m., a white man in an expensive suit walked into the restaurant. He carried a leather briefcase, wore polished shoes, and spoke with a clipped northern accent, New York, maybe Boston. He requested a booth near the window. Clara was assigned to his section. She approached with a menu, a glass of water, and a folded white linen napkin, the same setup she gave every customer. The man looked up from his briefcase. His face hardened. "Get me someone else," he said. Clara stopped. "Sir?" she asked, thinking she'd misheard. The man's voice rose, loud enough to carry across the quiet room. "I don't take food from your kind." Then he picked up the menu and threw it at her feet. It hit the floor with a slap that seemed louder than it was. Clara stood frozen, the napkin still in her hand, her face burning. Other diners turned to stare. The room went silent. 20 feet away, Malcolm X sat with his newspaper open, a half-finished plate of chicken in front of him, a white napkin on his lap. He didn't look up immediately, but his hands stopped moving. The security guard, a man named James who'd worked at the Audubon for 6 years, stepped forward, his jaw tight. He'd handled situations like this before. He knew how they usually ended. But before he took another step, Malcolm raised a single finger. James froze mid-stride. The silence in that room wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that precedes an explosion, the held breath before a fight. 40 people sat motionless, watching Malcolm X. They knew his reputation. They'd seen the interviews, heard the speeches. They expected fury. They expected a verbal evisceration, maybe worse. Malcolm folded his newspaper slowly, precisely, the way someone folds a flag. He stood. He picked up the white linen napkin from his own table and walked toward the booth where Clara stood and the white customer sat, his face drained of color now, recognizing too late who else was in the room. Malcolm's footsteps were the only sound. He reached the table and stood beside the man, not across from him, beside him, close enough to touch. He placed the napkin on the table between them. Then he spoke. His voice was quiet. Witnesses disagree on the exact words. James, the security guard, later said Malcolm told the man, "She's serving you the same food I just ate. If it's good enough for me, it's good enough for you." A woman sitting at table 6 remembered it differently. He asked the man if he knew what dignity cost. Clara herself, standing 3 feet away, said she couldn't make out the words, only the tone. Calm, almost gentle, like a teacher correcting a child who didn't know better. But everyone agrees on one thing. Malcolm never raised his voice. And his hand, when he placed it on the customer's shoulder, wasn't threatening. It was almost paternal. The customer sat frozen, his eyes locked on the table, his shoulders rigid. Malcolm remained standing, hand still resting on the man's shoulder, speaking in that low, steady voice no one else could hear. Then Malcolm bent down, picked up the menu from the floor, and placed it on the table in front of the customer. He didn't hand it to him. He just set it down, gently, like an offering. Time 0.5s. Then Malcolm did something no one expected. He slid into the booth across from the customer. He looked at Clara, who was still standing there, napkin clutched in her hands, and said, "2 coffees, please." Clara's hands were shaking when she poured. She brought 2 cups to the table, set them down, and stepped back. Malcolm and the customer sat in silence. No one in the restaurant moved. No one spoke. The only sound was the faint hiss of steam from the kitchen and the tick of the wall clock. 90 seconds passed. It felt like an hour. Then the customer started crying. Not sobbing, not loud, just silent tears running down his face, his shoulders shaking slightly. He didn't try to hide it. Malcolm reached across the table, picked up the white napkin he had brought from his own table, and slid it toward the man. The customer took it. He pressed it against his face. He wiped his eyes. And Malcolm just sat there, drinking his coffee, waiting. There was no anger in his posture, no triumph. Just patience. When the customer finally looked up, his face was red and wet, and he whispered something no one else heard. Malcolm nodded once. That was all. The customer stood up slowly, unsteadily, like a man who'd just survived something. He reached into his wallet, pulled out a $20 bill, and placed it on the table. The lunch he'd ordered, but never received, cost $3. He didn't ask for change. Time 0.5s. He still held the napkin Malcolm had given him, clutched in his right hand. He walked toward the exit without looking at anyone. His footsteps echoed. The door closed behind him. The restaurant remained silent for another few seconds, and then it erupted. Not in applause, this wasn't that kind of moment, but in a low, confused murmur. People whispered to each other, asking what they'd just seen, what it meant, whether it was real. Malcolm stayed seated. He finished his coffee. He didn't acknowledge the attention. James, the security guard, approached the table cautiously. "You okay, Brother Malcolm?" he asked. Malcolm looked up and smiled faintly. "I'm fine, James. Thank you." He stood, walked, to the counter, and paid his own bill in full. Then he He pulled a $10 bill from his pocket and handed it to Clara. Her meal, the one she'd been trying to serve the white customer, had cost $2.50. She stared at the money, then at Malcolm. "I can't," she started to say, but Malcolm shook his head. "You earned it," he said. Then he did one more thing. He pulled a pen from his jacket pocket, picked up a clean napkin from the counter, and wrote something on it. He folded it once and handed it to Clara. "Keep this," he said. She took it, too stunned to ask why. Malcolm nodded to her, nodded to James, and walked out. He never mentioned the incident again. Not in interviews, not in speeches, not in letters. It was as if it never happened. But it did happen, and the story spread through Harlem that afternoon like smoke. Clara told her mother. James told the other staff. Diners told their families. By evening, dozens of people had heard some version of it. Malcolm X confronting a racist, Malcolm X sitting with a racist, Malcolm X making a racist cry. The details shifted with each retelling, but the core remained. Something unexpected had occurred, something that didn't fit the narrative America had built around Malcolm X. No newspapers covered it. It was too small, too strange, too quiet. There was no violence, no shouting, no dramatic confrontation suitable for headlines. A blurred photograph surfaced a few weeks later, taken by someone in the restaurant with a cheap camera. It showed Malcolm's hand on the customer's shoulder, Clara standing in the background holding a coffee pot, the napkin visible on the table. The image was partial, out of focus, but unmistakable. By the time that photograph circulated, Malcolm was dead. 48 hours after the incident, on February 21, 1965, he was assassinated in the same building in the main hall upstairs while preparing to give a speech. 21 gunshot wounds. He was 39 years old. The napkin story was buried under the weight of grief, rage, conspiracy theories, and the enormous task of understanding what his death meant. Clara attended the funeral. She stood in the back, crying quietly, the napkin Malcolm had given her folded in her purse. She never showed anyone what he'd written on it. Not her mother, not her daughters, not the journalists who occasionally asked Harlem residents for memories of Malcolm. She kept it private for 30 years. Clara Washington lived another 30 years after Malcolm's death, and in that time, she changed. Not dramatically, not publicly, but in small, deliberate ways. She stopped serving white customers. Not out of anger or revenge, but out of choice. She'd been humiliated once, and she decided she wouldn't risk it again. She saved money. She took more classes. In 1972, she opened her own restaurant, a small place on 125th Street, nothing fancy, but hers. She hired young servers, mostly women, mostly black, and she trained them with a single rule that everyone who worked for her remembered. Treat every person like Malcolm's watching. Her daughters grew up hearing stories about the Audubon Ballroom, about the day their mother met Malcolm X, but Clara never gave them details. She showed them the napkin once, when they were teenagers. They saw the bloodstain on the corner, not Malcolm's blood, but Clara's. She'd gotten a nosebleed that afternoon from the stress, the humiliation, the shock. They saw the handwriting, faded but still legible, though they couldn't recall the exact words years later. Clara told them it was important, that it meant something, but she didn't explain what. In 1995, Clara Washington died of breast cancer at the age of 49. Her daughters held an estate sale. They donated items to different institutions, clothes to charity, books to the library, personal effects to various museums. The napkin went to the Smithsonian in an unmarked box with a handwritten note. He gave this to my grandmother, February 1965, Harlem. No name was mentioned. No context was given. The napkin sat in the Smithsonian archives for 8 years, uncatalogued, unexamined, nearly forgotten. In 2003, a graduate student named Keisha Morris was researching Malcolm X ephemera for her dissertation. She was looking for objects, letters, personal items, anything that might reveal the private man beneath the public figure. She spent weeks combing through archives, university collections, museum basements. One afternoon, she found a blurred photograph in the Life magazine archives. It was dated February 1965, location listed as Harlem. The image showed Malcolm X standing beside a white man in Chatra, a booth, his hand on the man's shoulder. There was a napkin on the table. Keisha had never seen the photograph before. It wasn't in any published collection. She started searching for the physical napkin, assuming it was lost. Then, a Smithsonian archivist mentioned an anonymous donation from 1995, a box of linens and personal items from a Harlem woman never fully processed. Keisha requested the box. When she opened it, she found the napkin. It matched the photograph exactly. Same fold, same bloodstain pattern. But there was something else. A message written in the corner, faded but readable. Keisha held the napkin under the archive light and read the handwriting, confirmed later through forensic analysis to be Malcolm X's. Dignity isn't given, it's recognized. You had it before he walked in. M. Keisha sat in that archive room for 20 minutes, staring at 9 words written by a man who'd been dead for 38 years. She traced Clara Washington's identity through the donation records. It took months. In 2004, she finally interviewed Clara's daughters. They remembered the napkin, remembered seeing it once, remembered their mother's insistence that it mattered. But they didn't know the full story. Keisha told them. Clara's daughters, both in their 40s by then, sat in Keisha's campus office and listened to the researcher explain what she'd found. They saw the photograph for the first time. They read their mother's note. They held the napkin carefully, reverently. One of them, Clara's youngest daughter, started crying. She never told us, she said. She never explained why she kept it. But Clara had left clues. Her restaurant, the one she'd opened in 1972, had a framed photograph on the wall, Malcolm X speaking at a podium, a wire service image anyone could buy. Underneath it, a small engraved plaque. Treat every person with dignity. The daughters hadn't connected it before. Now it made sense. Clara's rule for her staff, her insistence on respect, her refusal to serve certain customers. It all traced back to that February afternoon in 1965. Keisha asked if Clara had ever mentioned the white customer again, the man who'd humiliated her. The daughters looked at each other. Once, the older one said. She told me a man came into her restaurant in 1968, 3 years after Malcolm died. He was white, older, wearing a suit. He asked if she was Clara Washington. She said yes. He told her he'd been in the Audubon Ballroom in 1965. He said he was sorry. He asked if Malcolm X had really been killed there. She told him yes. He stood there for a minute, didn't order anything, then left. She never saw him again. Keisha wrote it down. Did she say anything else? She said he looked like he was carrying something heavy. She thought maybe he'd wanted forgiveness, but she didn't know if she had any to give. The daughters donated the napkin to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, which was under construction. At the time, it would take another 12 years before the museum opened and the napkin went on display. The National Museum of African American History and Culture opened in Washington, D.C. in September 2016. The napkin was placed in an exhibit titled Malcolm X Private Moments, alongside the 1965 photograph, Clara's handwritten donation note, and a timeline of Malcolm's final weeks. The display was small, tucked in a corner, easy to miss. But people didn't miss it. Visitors spent an average of 4 minutes standing in front of that case, longer than they spent at any other single exhibit item in the museum. The bloodstain was still visible. The message was still legible. The photograph, blown up and enhanced, showed Malcolm's face in profile, calm and focused, his hand resting on a man's shoulder. Within 72 hours of the exhibit's opening, someone photographed the display and posted it online. The image went viral. 40 million views in 3 days. Comment sections exploded. Some people saw Malcolm's compassion, his capacity for grace under pressure. Others saw tactical de-escalation, a calculated move to avoid violence. Still others saw something deeper, a man trying to live out a new philosophy, a Malcolm X in transition, evolving beyond the rhetoric that had made him famous and dangerous. Historians weighed in. Theologians analyzed it. Activists debated whether the story was even real, whether it had been mythologized, whether it mattered. But Clara's daughters appeared on national television and told the story their mother had kept private. They showed old photographs of Clara's restaurant, the plaque on the wall, the rules she'd lived by. The story was real. The napkin was real. The message was real. And it reshaped how a generation understood Malcolm X, not as a one-dimensional militant, but as a human being navigating impossible contradictions, capable of fury and tenderness, rage and patience, revolution and grace. The story also revealed a cost. Malcolm had given that customer dignity, had chosen conversation over confrontation, had extended humanity to someone who denied Clara's. 48 hours later, someone denied Malcolm his life. The grace he showed didn't protect him. It never does. The white linen napkin sits behind glass now in a climate-controlled case in Washington, D.C. The bloodstain is still visible in the corner, Clara's blood, not Malcolm's, a reminder that trauma leaves marks on the people who survive it. The handwriting is faded but legible. Dignity isn't given, it's recognized. You had it before he walked in. Emma. Museum guards report that people cry when they read it. Not everyone, but enough. Not from sadness exactly, but from recognition. The same tears that white customer cried in 1965. The sudden shock of seeing yourself clearly, of understanding what you've done or failed to do, of realizing that dignity was always there, waiting to be acknowledged. Clara Washington never became famous. Her restaurant closed in 1989. She died 6 years later, remembered by her daughters, her grandchildren, a few old customers who still told stories about her greens, and cornbread. She never gave interviews. She never wrote a memoir. She kept Malcolm's message private for 3 decades because it wasn't meant for the world. It was meant for her. But in the end, the world found it anyway. That's how these things work. Small moments, private exchanges, quiet acts of grace, they don't stay buried forever. Someone finds the napkin. Someone asks the right question. Someone connects the photograph to the object to the message to a larger story about who we are and who we could be. Malcolm X was killed 59 years ago. Clara Washington has been gone for 29. The white customer was never identified, never found, never held accountable except by his own conscience, assuming he had one. But the napkin survived. And the lesson it carries survived too, even if it took 40 years to find its voice. Treat every person with dignity, not because they deserve it, not because it's easy, but because dignity isn't a gift you give. It's a truth you recognize. Clara had it before that customer walked in. She had it when he threw the menu at her feet. She had it when Malcolm handed her that napkin. She never lost it. And that's the point. The napkin stays behind glass. The bloodstain stays visible. The message stays legible. Visitors keep coming, keep staring, keep crying. Some of them are white. Time sure pass. Some of them are black. Some of them are carrying their own shame, their own memories of moments they wish they could take back, their own questions about whether grace is possible, whether change is real, whether we can become better than we were. The museum doesn't answer those questions. The napkin doesn't answer those questions. But they ask them anyway, standing in that quiet corner, reading 9 words written by a man who knew he was going to die and chose compassion anyway. Malcolm X spent his final weeks reconsidering everything, his beliefs, his strategies, his relationships, his role. He was becoming someone new, someone softer, someone more human. He didn't get to finish that transformation. He was killed in the middle of it, in the same building where he'd sat across from a racist and offered him coffee. The napkin is evidence of that transformation. It's proof that people change, that rigid ideologies crack, that even the most militant among us can find room for tenderness. But it's also a reminder that grace doesn't guarantee safety. Malcolm gave that customer dignity. 2 days later, he was murdered. Clara kept the napkin for 30 years and died at 49. The customer cried, apologized, and disappeared. There's no happy ending here, no tidy moral, no proof that kindness is rewarded or that doing the right thing protects you from harm. The napkin just sits there, behind glass, holding a message that outlived everyone involved. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the point isn't that grace saves us. Maybe the point is that we do it. Anyway, we recognize dignity, we offer respect, we sit across from people who hate us, and we hand them a napkin when they cry. Not because it changes the world, but because it changes the moment. And sometimes, 40 years later, someone finds that moment preserved in a museum and remembers that we're capable of more than we think we are, even when the world is watching, even when it costs us everything.